Alright, welcome to I'm Not an Expert, but I thought this was helpful. And here's how I made Anne Boleyn's skirt panels from Six the Musical. Now there are a lot of materials, so definitely screenshot this list and I promise I'll go over each material as I use it. The driving factor of Boleyn's skirt is the symmetrical square pattern, and depending on your measurements and how long you want your skirt to be will determine the exact placement of the cutouts. However, you will always have 3 rows of 3x3 squares and at least 2 rows of 5x5 squares. The most important thing to remember, regardless of size, is to keep your panels symmetrical with a clear center line. Based off of my waist measurements and keeping the length true to the show, here's a template for where I cut my squares, which will be similar to most skirt patterns. Carefully cut the squares just inside the dotted line texture that you can see on the fabric, and make sure to keep a good grip on your blade. This is somewhat time consuming, so don't rush, and don't forget to cut out the 2 partial squares that are in the bottom row. Once your squares are cut, you'll add the 9 individual studs in these locations, and all you have to do is push the pronged end through the fabric and then bend the prongs outwards away from the stud to help reduce puckering. With the top layer finished, you'll top stitch this to the green vinyl, at which point I recommend using spray adhesive to temporarily stick your fabrics together. For all of the sewing on the skirt, I used a leather needle, and I started by sewing the panel edges with a 1/8 seam allowance. I then top stitched each cutout as close to the edge as possible, using that dotted texture as a guideline. At this point, I then switched to my zipper foot, which allowed me to sew right next to the studs without running over any of them. I sewed the remaining 2 layers of fabric together in the exact same way, stitching the inner facing to the wrong side of the green vinyl lining. And then before sewing all 4 panels together, the vinyl inner facing panel to the wrong side of the green vinyl square panel we just finished, I then switched to my walking foot, which just helps to guide and push the fabrics through your machine. With the panel itself done, it's now time for the trim, and I actually sewed some 1/4-inch plastic boning to the bottom edge of my panels, making sure to leave space on both ends for the seam allowance, which for my pattern is about 5/8. I then captured the boning with a pleather bias tape, stitching it to the underside of the panel first, then folding it up and around the edge to the front of the panel, top stitching it in place. The final step is to glue down the studded trim with E6000, and the trim I purchased actually has an iron-on backer which I peeled off, along with the last 2 studs on either end to account for my seam allowance. Glue the trim directly to the top of your bias tape, and once it's secured, your panel's done. Now just do that 8 more times, and then you can start sewing your skirt.